Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm managing editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access all the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free podcast episodes, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints recently announced plans to add 55 missions across the globe next year. That's the most since the Utah-based faith of 17.5 million members created 58 missions in 2013. And brings its total tally worldwide to 506. At the same time, the current core of full-time missionaries has topped 84,000, and according to Apostle Quentin Cook, convert baptisms during the first 6 months of 2025 ran 20% higher than the first half of last year. So what do all these positive numbers mean when it comes to the pace and prospects of church growth now and in the future? Independent researcher Matt Martinick, who tracks such data for the websites Camorra.com and LDSchurchgrowth.blogspot.com, wrote an analysis of the new missions and joins us today virtually to discuss his findings. Matt, welcome back to Mormon Land.
Thanks for having me again, Dave.
Yeah. So did the announcement of these new missions surprise you?
You know, I guess the question to ask to begin with is the number of missions surprised me, or the distribution location of the mission surprised me?
Let's start with the number.
Okay. It did surprise me. I didn't think there was going to be that many missions. I was thinking more like maybe 30 to 40 range like there was back in 2024. So it did surprise me that there was that many new missions that were reported to be organized this coming year.
Okay. Without diving into the details, which we will discuss, what surprised you the most besides the higher number?
Well, the biggest thing was the geographic distribution of these new missions. If we look at other years when we've had many new missions created at once, typically we've seen that pretty heavy on areas that have a pretty significant Latter-day Saint presence. So we see a lot of those missions being organized in the Intermountain West, particularly in Utah, southern Idaho, Arizona. We usually see a lot of those places get these missions because the historical logic and the church for the last few decades has been, we put the missionaries where most of the members are. And so that's where most of these members are in the church. So that's oftentimes why we've seen that correlation there. This time around, we did not see that. So out of these 55 new missions, none of them are planned for Utah. None of them are planned for Idaho, except for extreme northern Idaho and Coeur d'Alene. So that's a pretty big departure from what we've seen in other years when we've had a lot of new missions being created. And we're seeing a lot in places in Africa and other locations with large populations that have historically been pretty underserved by mission resources.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of those areas. But one item your analysis points out right up front, which I think is often overlooked, is that creating new missions doesn't come cheap. Now, we know the church has deep pockets, of course, but explain what those costs entail and what this financial commitment demonstrates.
Yeah, and I think that's something that can't be understated, because if you think of the financial resources to staff a mission, they're really quite significant. Now, I've never been privy to those numbers for a mission. Even when I was a full-time missionary, I wasn't ever an office missionary or anything, but if you think about what goes into that, I mean, we have housing for missionaries. The airfare is usually quite significant as well. You have to look at things like applying for visas. There's a lot of those kind of fees that come with administrative things. And we also have meeting those missionary needs in terms of really that missionary program is quite heavily subsidized by the church. And that's been the way for several decades now. And so really, it represents a pretty significant investment in financial resources, people, and just physical real estate, really, to pull this off, because that's a lot. I mean, think of when they're training all these new mission presidents, they're already going to be training about a third of the current missions for their new mission presidents that'll be replaced. And then you're going to add another 55 couples on top of that. That's a lot to do at once.
Yeah, you have to have a mission office, right? You'd have to have a mission home, I guess, where the president.
Right. There's two vehicles.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
That.
Yeah.
Okay, so Matt, briefly tell our listeners where the new missions are being created and what that says about church growth in those areas in present and future.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about, 55 new missions are planned for 2026. 17 of those missions are in Africa, so that's about 31%. The next world region that has the most new missions being organized is North America. That's 16 missions, 29%. Latin America, there'll be 8 new missions. That's about 14.5% of all the missions that will be created. Asia, there'll be 6. Oceania will be 5. Europe will be 3.
So what does that tell us about church growth in those areys?
I think it tells us a few things. So first of all, it's helpful to look at the trends for where new missions have been historically created in the church. And often it's been disproportionate to those heavily Latter-day Saint areas and not really reaching places where most of the world's population lives. So with these new numbers, with these new missions being created, we're seeing a much more equal distribution of missions across world regions, particularly targeting areas with larger populations. So if we look at mission distribution by region in terms of how that will change from before and after these announcements, really for most world regions, we're not seeing a big difference. The biggest one is for Africa. So 14%, going from 12% to 14% is what that will look like from before and after with these new missions being created. And then that 2% is being taken away from Latin America, coming up with a smaller share of that. So like I said, greater worldwide distribution in terms of reaching populations that are, in terms of the size of these populations. Also, the church has been growing tremendously in Africa. And this is a decision that seems to be motivated not just by meeting the current demands, but also expanding in the immediate future. If we look at the number of new missions created from 2013, which was the year we had the most new missions ever created in Africa, there were 5 new missions created that year. If we look at 2024, when there were 36 new missions created worldwide, there was about 8 or 9 new missions created that year. And then this year it's going to be 17, or sorry, not this year, but next year will be 17. So, that's a pretty big increase, steady increase in Africa to really help meet those needs there and opportunities that are really present throughout the continent, almost in all places.
So you estimate the average number of missionaries per mission with this expansion would be 166. It has sometimes topped 200. What does it matter how many missionaries are assigned? Why does it matter how many missionaries are assigned to each mission?
Yeah, it's almost like congregations in the church. If you have too few members, it creates problems. If you have too many, it creates problems. And missionaries and missions is really fairly similar. If you have a mission where there's just 30 missionaries, there's been missions like that. Angola, the mission there, had that few missionaries for quite some time, many years ago. It creates a lot of issues. It's hard to open new areas. It can create challenges of training, and it's just less effective. Now, if you get to too many missionaries, when you see some really large missions that are pushing 200, 250, it's really hard for the mission president to get to know the missionaries and to adequately train them, develop a relationship with them. There's a lot of mentoring that goes into a quality mission president working with his missionaries. And it's really hard to do that, just like it'd be hard for a bishop to be an effective leader for a congregation that had 400 people come to church a week or something, right? So it's important to have that around that time. And if we look at those historical averages for what the church has had for number of missionaries per mission, it's typically fluctuated between about 150 and 200, with rare exceptions of going below or above that.
It's Matt, you're right. It's with rare exception, returned missionaries often, their mission president, for good or ill, is one of the most important figures in their life, quite often the rest of their life, right?
Yeah, I would say that's the case from people I've spoken to, my own experience with my mission president. That they really carry a significant influence on missionaries based on, for a lot of people, being a full-time missionary is the most difficult thing they've ever done or will ever do. And those experiences can really make an impact for good or for bad, like you said.
Yeah. So obviously, Apostle Quentin Cook talks about the growing number of missionaries, but are there enough missionaries now and coming in the pipeline to fill these missions?
Well, based on the numbers, surpassing 84,000, really the church would need to create this many new missions to keep it at that same level there, between that 150 and 200. So the idea that the church maybe is creating these missions to make it look more impressive, that the church is growing so much when it's not, that doesn't really hold any merit here, because really they're creating missions based on the number of missionaries serving. And we see that looking at tracking the number of missionaries per mission over time. And those two metrics really mirror each other quite well. Although the mission one tends to be a bit more stable and smoothed out, whereas with the number of missionaries serving, that can be a bit more spiky over the years based on things going on that impact missionary serving.
Okay, let's drill down on Africa a little bit more. Like you say, we know the church is growing rapidly in many countries there, including the Democratic Republic of Congo. Talk about the new African missions, maybe highlight some that you think and how they might help the proselytizing effort in those places.
I think that the expansion of the church in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is something that surpasses anything the church has seen in decades. Just to think that 20 years ago, there was one mission in the entire country, and next year there'll be 9 missions. So that is pretty phenomenal mobilization of mission resources in a country that has some of the highest member activity and convert retention rates in the world. So it is really a powerhouse when it comes to church growth. And it's not just something where it's numbers on paper that look impressive, but there's nothing to back it. There certainly is that to back it. Just recently, there was a stake conference in Kolwezi a couple months ago, and they created a second stake in that city. They had 4,000 people at the stake conference to create that second stake. So that's pretty remarkable to think about. Now, of course, that presents a lot of challenges, especially with leadership development. When you have so many new members that really have very little training, it really requires a lot of support and help from area presidencies and current leaders and past leaders and so forth. So the DR Congo, again, a major powerhouse for growth. The last couple of years, we've had a really unprecedented expansion of the church into dozens of additional cities, towns, and even villages, which has really not happened much in that country. So with these new missions, we'll likely see continued growth that will likely even accelerate past what we're seeing now. There's already over 100,000 Latter-day Saints in the DR Congo, but there's over 100 million people in the country. So even with the new missions, there'll be an average of one mission per about 10 million people, if not more than that. So, and there's still provinces that don't even have a branch. So, there's a lot of expansion opportunities in the DR Congo. So that's one country. There's many others. And in terms of some others that stand out to me, some of the missions that really surprised me were like in Mozambique, the new mission that'll be organized in Nampula. That's a city with one stake with 6 wards and 2 branches in that stake. And there's one district in Tete that'll likely be part of that mission. But again, very few members. And that's the trend we see with these mission announcements, is that many of these new missions are being created in places where the church has very little church infrastructure, if any at all. Senegal is another example. In Senegal, there's 300 members of the church that are in 5 small branches. So, and that's it. And if you look at other countries that'll be part of that new mission, the Gambia has 2 branches. Guinea-Bissau likely will be a part of it. Actually, not Guinea-Bissau, right? Just Guinea will be a part of it. There's 3 branches there, and maybe Mali will be a part of it too. But again, that's very few members. And if we look at how new missions have been created in Africa, even in the recent past, typically there's several stakes. There's like 100, or there's about 10,000 members that live in that area that's being affected by the new missions. So we're seeing much more aggressive national outreach expansion than we have seen historically.
Mormon Land will be right back.
Matt, I'm going to jump ahead to something because you're bringing it up. Could you briefly explain the church's centers of strength model? It seems like you're touching on how that's changing, with this, how this may represent a little bit of a departure or an evolution.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And with the centers of strength policy, really that became fairly widespread in the early to mid 90s and has guided the expansion of the church in most areas of the world for the last 3 decades. And really the main point of this policy is that the church deliberately limits where it assigns missionaries and where it operates congregations in most countries around the world until those select areas become sufficiently strong to be able to legitimize opening new areas to missionary work and create new congregations. So there's pros and cons of this approach. I mean, one of the pros is that it helps conserve resources. It helps to really try to strengthen the church in these core areas. The cons to this approach can be that some of these places that are selected just never really take off, and that comes at the expense of potentially more receptive areas being overlooked or outreach being delayed. And by the time outreach occurs, maybe receptivity is not that great. So there's pros and cons to the centers of strength policy, but we've definitely seen much more of a loosening of that. It seems with a lot of the distribution of resources. We have some other missions that are being created next year that are in similar situations where we have less than 2,000 members in the area that will likely serve the mission. But even then, it's still not to where it was in the 1970s and 80s and early 90s, where, the last time we had as many new missions that were created in countries that did not previously have a mission was in 1990, where 5 countries had their first missions organized. And all of those countries had actually less than 500 members in each one. So, that's very different now. Right now, the only country that really fits that type of similarity there would be Senegal, which has 300 members. So, it's not quite the same as we saw then. And I think that might indicate some missed opportunities. And that's something I mentioned in my article where, if we were looking at more of a return to what we saw in the 80s and early 90s, we would likely see a mission in the Central African Republic, for example, or a mission in Cuba, or places like that.
So just one last question about Africa. It's a big continent, Are there some countries where there are no missions?
Yes, there's plenty. And there's not just countries where there's no missions in Africa. There's countries that have religious freedom that don't even have a branch in them. And to give you an example of some of those, Equatorial Guinea, Sao Tome and Principe is another one. You have others that historically have given a lot more freedom to Christians, and more recently that's been more restricted, like in Burkina Faso and Niger. But there are a number of countries where the church has no formal presence still.
Okay, let's move over to the Philippines. It's obviously rapidly expanding. Missions and temples. How will these new missions help there?
Well, really, I would see the new missions being organized in the Philippines as a greater saturation of what mission infrastructure is already there. Currently, there's 26 missions in the Philippines. There'll be 31 once the 5 new missions are created. And I don't know if I checked this before, but I believe that's the most new missions created in the Philippines in a single year ever. So that's pretty significant. The Philippines has 118 million people that live in the country, so it's a large population. There's still fewer than 1 million Latter-day Saints. It's about 900,000 members of the church in the Philippines. So with these new missions, a lot of what we'll see with them being organized will be expanding into lesser reached areas where there is no church presence. And the Philippines, it's not like a lot of countries in Asia where there's better public transportation and it's easier to get from place to place. There's many islands. A lot of times it can be a challenge to travel even on the same island from one place to another. So I think that these new missions will really be a catalyst for opening more member groups and branches. And even this year, we've had a significant increase in congregations in the Philippines. And I believe my last count on that was, I think, somewhere around 30 or 40, maybe even 50, actually. So we're seeing a lot of really strong growth in the Philippines. most of those new units are being created in places that have never had an official congregation. So I think there's a lot of potential for the church to continue to expand the Philippines, even though it's the country with the fourth most Latter-day Saints in the world. There's still a lot of opportunities. I mean, less than 1% of the population's Latter-day Saints.
But also historically had terrible retention, which is why they sent Dallin Oaks there, years ago, because it had very, very low retention. How is its retention compared to Africa?
Yeah, great question, Peggy. So that's a kind of a hard question because it depends on where in Africa you're talking about. There's places in Africa that have very low retention for sure. Now in the Philippines, I mean, really it is a remarkable success story in the last 10, 15 years where, like you had mentioned, Peggy, a lot of retention issues, a lot of activity problems. And we saw that change, especially about 15 years ago. And since then, the number of stakes in the Philippines has increased from about 80 to, as of my most recent count from new stakes created in the last week or two, 139. So that's an increase of about 70 stakes in about 15 years. And if you think about the new standards for creating stakes, that's actually increased in places like the Philippines. So we've seen a remarkable improvement with convert retention and member activity. Some of the districts that have become stakes recently have been districts for decades. So I think it really signals a major improvement on many levels with leadership and member activity. Sacrament meeting attendance in the Philippines has increased by tens of thousands, even within short periods of time, even outpacing membership growth. So suggesting that member activity rates are improving. Now, of course, if we look at the country as a whole, the activity rates are still fairly modest. And a lot of that is because of all those years we had very low retention, and those members are still on the records, and many of them are not active.
Okay, so switching to Europe. Europe is getting the fewest new missions, only 3, yet President Dallin Oaks just called the faith's third European apostle, Frenchman Gerald Cosset. How is the church faring in Europe, and how might these 3 European apostles help with that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing to think about. And it seems really interesting that with these recent apostles we've had, we're not really getting them from Africa or Latin America as much. I mean, of course, we have Elder Suarez, but it's really interesting to see that because in terms of membership, Europe has a very small church membership, both compared to the countries of where the church is at in Europe, and also looking at those European members and what percent of the world or of the church membership around the world, what they represent. So in terms of what that might mean, I think with our newest apostle, Elder Cosset, I believe I'm saying that right.
Cosset, yeah.
Yeah, Cosset, there we go. I don't speak French, so I've tried my best. But anyway, one of the things that's going to be a wonderful benefit from him being an apostle is him being able to minister to these Francophone African countries. And there's so many of them in Africa. And they also tend to be some of the countries where the church is growing most quickly. So I think that really presents an exciting opportunity for the church to have an apostle that's also fairly young, comparatively speaking, being able to likely visit these
Everything
members.
is relative.
Everything's relative, right? But I think that is exciting.
A mere 62, yes.
Yes.
Right, mere 62. So I think that's something exciting for the church and some great opportunities there. In terms of Europe and how the church has been doing there, things have also been doing really quite well. And we've been seeing really, quite frank, record numbers of convert baptisms even this year. And we've heard some statements that have spoken more generally about it. Reports I've gotten from missionaries in Europe that are current ones have supported that as well. And really some tremendous progress being made. I mean, just this year alone, we've had an increase of over 10 congregations in Spain, which hasn't happened in decades. So it seems like the retention is there to a certain extent. Of course, we'll be able to have a better idea of what this looks like in the long term if we're seeing an increase in congregations that's coming along with it. But it does seem like things have been improving. However, I think a lot of this growth in Europe is not coming from the local population in terms of the native population of a lot of these countries. They tend to be immigrant groups. that are primarily the driving force for these convert baptisms and increases in membership. And Spain is a perfect example of that, where in Spain, most of the congregations are predominantly made up of foreigners, especially from Latin America.
Yeah, we hear that. We hear that a lot from missionaries coming back from Europe.
I wrote a whole story about that too.
Yes. So let's jump to the U.S. There are 14 new missions in the U.S. As you said, none in Utah, none in southern Idaho, but 3 in Texas, 3 in California. What do you see about the church's reasoning in the ones you saw that were created in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think they kind of fall into 2 main categories, Dave. One of those has to do with where are the largest populations in the United States. And those are California and Texas, right? And so that's 6. 6 out of the, what is it? Was it 14?
14, yeah.
Little numbers. So, I mean, that's almost half are just in those 2 states. So I think that's one big driving force behind the missions is the church is saying, well, where are the people? We're going to put the missionaries where the people are. And then generally that's a pretty effective practice to do because you're reaching people with where they're at. And that's a very important thing for finding people and helping the church be better established in places where there's lots of people. The other kind of mission that I think fits in terms of, where are these missions being created, what's kind of the trend there, has to do with missions being created in places where there was a mission previously. And so many of these new missions that are being organized, they already have had missions in the past, and they were discontinued, most of which were discontinued in the late 2010s, coming at the end of that double cohort of missionary serving when the missionary age was decreased for men and women. So it seems like in the church there are some of these missions that are kind of like an overflow mission where it's like, hey, we have a lot of missionaries. We need to find a place to put them. We'll reopen this mission for now. And then if we need to use these missionaries somewhere else, we'll close it again later. So it seems like that is the dynamic with some of these U.S. missions. Also with missionary serving, there's some American missionaries where for various reasons they can't serve internationally. And so it's very important that they are provided a meaningful experience to be a full-time missionary in the United States. And so that also provides that for these missionaries.
So, Matt, are there any countries or places that may be getting missionaries for the first time?
Based on these changes?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in terms of countries that are going to have their very first missions organized, there are 5 that I had mentioned, or 5 before. And those missions are Greece. And now Greece, of course, did have a mission for decades in Athens that closed, but is going to be reopened. So Greece is going to have a mission. Malawi is another country that's never had a mission organized in it before. Currently, Malawi is assigned to the Zambia-Lusaka mission. There's Senegal. Senegal is currently assigned to one of the missions in Cote d'Ivoire. Solomon Islands never had a mission before. That is currently part of the Vanuatu Port Vila mission. And then there's Togo. And Togo's also never had a mission. And that country is currently assigned to the Benin Cotonou mission. So again, never had mission in those countries before. Missionaries do serve there, though. All these countries have had missionaries serve there for years, often decades, except for Senegal. That's been more recent. So now in terms of new countries where we've never had missionaries assigned that might be affected by this, I don't think there's any, to be honest, that stand out to me besides with Sao Tome and Principe in Africa, with a second mission in Angola. I imagine that will be helpful with the church establishing a official presence there. And I can see also with some of these new missions being created, it'll free up resources in missions that are being, where they're part of that mission being divided to create a new mission. That remaining mission from what was there before will likely help with establishing church in other places, like in Seychelles, for example. That was a country where they had the first apostle visit just in the last week or two. Elder Razban visited there. So, I think there's going to be some opportunities like that, but there's not a country that stands out to me that's like, well, they're creating this mission so they can go into there with an official church presence. Nothing else really stands out to me.
So as you know, President Oaks paused the announcement of new temples. as a church works to advance the ones that are already been announced, how might new temples correlate to the new missions?
One of the factors that seems to correlate with temple announcements has to do with where missions are located. And so you'll see many new missions being created, or not new missions, but new temples being announced where there is a mission already there. And so that seems to be a trend that we see. And that also is a trend that predated President Nelson announcing temples. Although I think we saw that even more often when he was president of the church. So in terms of temple announcements, I was really not surprised about the pause in terms of not announcing any new temples this last conference for two reasons. One is because we didn't have a first presidency officially reorganized yet. And then secondly, we have over 100 temples that really are in the very earliest stages of planning. That is a significant burden on the temple department to get that all worked out, one of which is the temple here in Colorado Springs that we'll have here. So it's, there's definitely a need to address that. Now, I don't think this means we're not going to get any temple announcements. What I would anticipate in the coming years is maybe more like 5 to 10 announced per conference or per year, because there are certainly places that are in desperate need of a temple right now that have not had one announced.
Matt, your analysis talks about this at the end, but also you've mentioned this a little bit. What do you see as some missed opportunities, places where you'd like to see the church invest more proselytizing energy and resources?
Yeah, before I answer that, one quick point I'll make is, and the reason why I'm making this is because it goes into your question you just asked, Dave. So this year, the church created one new mission, and it wasn't necessarily widely published, but it was a new mission in Europe. And I believe it's called the European Central Turkic-speaking mission. And it's a mission that's specifically for outreach to people who speak Farsi and also who speak Turkic languages. So the reason why I mention that is I think that is an area that really could use some attention in terms of mission planning going forward. When you have mission resources that are specifically tailored to particular languages, that can make things much more effective. So in Latin America, for example, there's many countries that have significant Amerindian populations that speak languages that really could benefit from something like that. I think that is a missed opportunity potentially with this round of announcements. Of course, there are countries and locations where the church is very small or almost non-existent that would really benefit from having a mission established. In the article I wrote, one of the ones that really stood out to me was Timor-Leste, or East Timor, predominantly Christian population, remote area in Indonesia. That's over kind of by Australia is where Timor is. So and that's a place where there's one branch in the whole country, pretty small, tiny church in a sense presence. So I think that there are places like that could really benefit from a mission just because there's opportunity for growth with receptivity, government restrictions on religious freedom being really quite minimal or not there at all. And there are also places where in terms of population-wise that resources are just not being allocated sufficiently to meet that demand as much or opportunity. And that includes in Europe, for example. So if we look at how many missions will be in Europe with these new missions being created next year, that's still less than half the total number of missions in Europe 25 years ago, which when I realized that really stood out to me as a shock to think, oh my goodness, we had that many more missions in Europe in 2000. It was about 100. And with these new changes, we'll have 40. Right now it's 37. So, Europe has a lot of people in it, and a lot of places have been minimally reached. Of course, there are many places where receptivity is extremely low, so it might not be really an area that would benefit from additional resources, perhaps. But the thing is that things change, and that's the important thing to keep in mind with these missions being created is that something 20 years ago that maybe would not have been effective, may not have been effective then, might be effective now. And if you look at Tonga as an example, when the church created its first mission in Tonga in the 1880s, it was incredibly unsuccessful. They baptized only a couple dozen converts, and they closed the mission because it was so unsuccessful. And today the church in Tonga is almost 2/3 the national population. Now, of course, activity rate, it's like a third of the population are members that identify as Latter-day Saints now, but that's still a remarkable achievement to think this was a place where, for a decade or two, they threw in the towel to say, this is not productive. This isn't going nowhere. Well, they reopened that a decade or two later, and we saw very different results. And so it can go both ways. We can see it being more receptive in the past, less now, and vice versa. And that's why it's important that these shifts in resources is dynamic to really help to hit when the iron's hot.
Matt Martinick, thanks so much for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.